Bad protagonists. They're some of literature's most compelling characters. Patrick Bateman, Dorian Gray, Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. Main characters who are intentionally unlikable, but with whom we're expected to spend a whole novel. I'd chuck Lolita, Confederacy of Dancers, The Secret History, and some more of the Russian classics into this bin. What do all these bad guys have in common? A big old penis, that's what. What about the bad women? There certainly are instances of morally complex female characters that some readers take issue with. But I'm after women who we're not meant to get along with, who scare, anger, or straight up sicken the reader. I'm not looking for villains, anti-heroes, not for the merely misunderstood. I want female characters who are their own protagonist and antagonist. The good, the bad, and the ugly, all rolled into one. I find it hard to explain why I'm so interested in this style of protagonist. Perhaps it says a lot about me that some of my favourite stories feature protagonists that are, let's say, troubled. Part of it has to be the inversion of the standard story, where we feel happy when the protagonist succeeds and unhappy when they fail. In these stories, we're hoping for the main character to get ground into the dirt. More than that, however, it's because these stories are about exploring from the inside what makes bad people bad. For all Stephen King says about exploring why people do bad things, his stories are the pinnacle of dehumanizing evil. I mean, one of his most famous baddies is the literal embodiment of badness. Pennywise never pauses while brushing its teeth to reflect on all the child murdering. When trying to explain evil in the real world, the justification, they're just bad people, has never sat well with me. Sane, rational people, much less groups of people, rarely self-identify as evil. Their actions are the result of weakness, or fear, or a struggle for the greater good, and I find it fascinating spending a novel hanging out in that headspace. And it's not like saying or doing hateful things is dependent on them having a dick. I'm interested in stories with unlikable female protagonists, because they have the potential to say something new. American Psycho is about consumerism, cocaine, and masculinity. It wouldn't be the same novel if it were written about a woman in the 1980s. What untold stories exist that explore how modern society isolates and dehumanizes women? This style of protagonist has seen something of a vogue in recent years, with varying degrees of success. Today, I'd like to discuss two examples of deliberately unlikable women to illustrate the do's and don'ts of problematic protagonists. Before we move on, let me head off some criticism. Some owl criticism, Lichen supplies. The eagle-eyed viewer will notice I've avoided any mention of the anti-hero protagonist, as seen in books like the You series and a billion airport thrillers, for people who like true crime podcasts and reading their porn. For all his dubious acts, Joe and his ilk are ultimately meant to win the reader over. You want them to succeed. Here, I want to focus on the protagonists who, at the very least, you'd never want to have dinner with or without a barrier of bulletproof glass. And that brings us to our two case studies. Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh. Two books that focus on bad women. Ever heard of Fleetwood Mac? Taylor Jenkins Reid certainly has. Our first bad protagonist is Daisy Jones, singer-songwriter, drug addict, and renowned beauty. She's a Stevie Nicks sort with a dash of Janis Joplin. Welcome to the early 70s in California. Now immediately forget the time we are. You can ignore the setting altogether. I mean, it's not like they all gather around to watch the moon landing or anything. The Vietnam War comes up a bit at the beginning, in an inconsequential way, but this isn't exactly Forrest Gump. Daisy Jones and the Six, funnily enough, follows Daisy Jones as she goes from LA rich kid and exploited groupie in the mid-60s to international music icon 15 years later through the unrelenting power of drugs and already being beautiful. She's a fantastic singer too, but it's made very clear throughout the book that this is in spite of, or even because of, her refusal to train her vocals. This isn't a tale of passion and hard work, not on the side of Daisy Jones at least. It's true, people are awful to Daisy on her way up. People take advantage of her and belittle her. But it feels like the book goes out of its way to make her seem unreasonable, even around those who are good to her. If you hadn't already guessed from my tone, Daisy Jones and the Six falls heavily into the don'ts category of how to do problematic protagonists, as well into the don'ts on how to write an interesting and fun novel generally, but that's another video. Why I'm happy to call Daisy Jones an unlikable protagonist is partly because of her aforementioned lack of effort to achieve all she does in the book, but mainly because of her many awful acts towards those the book describes as her closest friends. I don't know about you, but if a friend of mine begged me to fly out and meet them in Thailand and then dipped right before I arrived, I doubt they'd make it onto that year's Christmas card list. So, she's unlikable, but we knew that, that's why she's on the docket. Why am I pointing to Daisy Jones as the bad kind of bad? For me, it all comes down to the world around her. Daisy is beautiful, but this isn't presented as a feature of her arrogance, but as a fact of the world. Here she is, falling deeper into drug dependency, and yet, whenever we read that she's beautiful, it's always begrudgingly in the mouths of strangers. It's never once suggested that her beauty might be fading, and that her own ego is what's keeping the myth going. In the same spirit, we have her talent as a singer. A good bad protagonist might viciously defend her right to sing her own songs, even as her lifestyle starts to make her sound like a tumble dryer full of forks. Or we might get to witness her natural talent languish, because of her refusal to put in effort. But no, she succeeds in spite of herself, almost as if the message of the book is, hey, why not be an asshole? It worked for Miss Jones. No, a bad protagonist doesn't have to be struck down for their sins, but if they do succeed, then the book should at least allude to the structural problems in the world of the story that allow them to succeed. Which, sort of, brings us to our second of today's novels, the oddly similar, startlingly different 2018 hit The first piece of Moshfegh's I ever read was a 2017 short story collection, Homesick for Another World, and I thought about that what I thought about my year of rest and relaxation. Jesus Christ, everyone is awful. We all remember that episode of Rick and Morty, where they get the unhealthy parts of their personalities sucked out, only for those unhealthy parts to turn the whole world unhealthy. As far as I can tell from the two pieces I've read, Moshfegh's stories exclusively take place in that green unhealthy world. Everyone isn't just awful, arguably they're not awful at all, they are the worst parts of themselves. The only emotions that motivate anybody are fear, disgust, self-loathing, and hate. God, I bet even the lollipop ladies in Moshfegh's stories only volunteer because they enjoy being able to decide which children live and which get crushed by speeding lorries. In my year of rest and relaxation, I went on a silent meditation retreat to Bali, and I met a beautiful... In the novel, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, we follow an unnamed New Yorker, who I like to think is called Melanie Bojangles, as she retreats from life into a medically induced hibernation. She is independently wealthy, which as always means she inherited her money, beautiful, and even more the worst than everyone else in this book. There isn't a ton to remark on plot-wise. I won't spoil what story beats we do get, from the more subtle middle parts to the giant flaming conclusion. The only important thing to note for discussion is that, like Daisy, Melanie Bojangles has a lot of the qualities I want from a bad protagonist. She's awful to her one friend from college, Reva, and goes out of her way to be petty, spiteful, and difficult, if never outright evil. So, where does Madame Bojangles succeed where Daisy Jones failed? As I mentioned before, it all comes down to the world. Let's draw a direct comparison. I've already mentioned how in Daisy Jones and the Six, God, this week has some long book titles, Daisy stays beautiful even as her drug habit grows, this being presented as an immutable fact separate from Daisy's personality. In My Year of Rest and Relaxation, other characters mention that Melanie is looking thin and pale, and the only indication we get that she is still attractive is when Melanie herself looks in the mirror and says, "Yep, I'm still beautiful." It's making a statement about the protagonist's vanity, how despite her apparent disinterest, she still cares deeply about how she appears to others. There are a dozen more examples like this. Why does Melanie Bojangles get to live in a luxurious apartment without working, while her friend works constantly to afford a place in the unattractive part of the city? Is it because of some innate talent Melanie has over her peers? Nope, she was born rich and inherited her money from her parents. It all mixes together to make Melanie a more complex character all around. She treats life as a joke, but the story puts the work in to make this seem a tragic result of her own failings as a person, not as something quirky to be admired. No, I wouldn't ever want to be in the same room as Senora Bojangles, not without some deodorizing spray. But like Dorian Gray, like Patrick Bateman, she rides that line of hateability so that her actions, while not being excusable, may at the very least be understandable.